Well, I'll have to start where I left off on the other side of the tape. If you remember, we'd got to the end of Sam Strettle's farm, and I was telling you that at this particular point, the border of Rainhill, or the boundary, whichever you like to call it, ran right through the middle of the farmyard. The farmhouse was in Rainhill, and the stables and the shippons and the barns, they were on the right-hand side of the farmhouse, but they came in Whiston. And Whiston was a village adjoining Rainhill. Now, after we'd got past Sam Strettle's farm, we came to a row of 4 cottages which were called Church View. And it was in this row of cottages that I used to live, or my parents used to live, and I lived there with them before I came to Nottingham. Now, after we'd passed these 4 cottages by the name of Church View, there was 2 more cottages, and then there was a shop. This shop, it sold sweets and tobacco and cigarettes and all the small kinds of things that you'd expect to find in that type of a shop. But also, he was a news agent. The name was Townsend, and it was run by a widow, Mrs. Townsend. And by the way, when I was a newsboy, it was Mrs. Townsend that employed me. But going on from that, it was the only place where you could get stamps, because it was kind of a village post office. But the only thing you could get from Townsend was stamps and postal orders. There was nothing else, no postal business the kind that you're likely to find in a post office today. Of course, times were different altogether then. Now, after Townsend, there was another small cottage, and then there was a kind of what we call a drive leading off at right angles. That would be on the left, and they led down to the manse. The manse was, of course, where the minister of the Congregational Church, which was in the Old, resided. And just to the right of the house, we also had a bowling green, and this bowling green belonged to the church, and they were mostly church members and Sunday school members and such like who used this bowling green. Now, at the opposite side to the drive, on the roadway, we came to a public house. This was called the Holt Inn, and the landlord was a man named Fred Crompton, a big burly man of about 6 foot high and broad, a man who was well able to deal with drunks when they proved a bit difficult. And passing from the Holt Inn, there was 2 more cottages, and then we came to a high wall. It would be about 8 foot high. But behind this high wall was some gardens, and these gardens belonged to a row of cottages that were higher up the road. Instead of the gardens being behind the house, they were at the side of the row of cottages. And there was about 10 cottages altogether, and it was here that what we call the Holt ended. Now, that's about as far as I'll go as regards the Holt. On the left-hand side of the road, that's imagining that we're going towards Liverpool. Now, I've got to go back now to describe the Holt itself more, so I'll go back to the right-hand side of the road, and we're left off where we'd just passed 2 fields, and we came to a row of 6 cottages. Now, the first of these cottages was a man lived there named John Ball. By the way, he was the superintendent of the Sunday school, very religious man. And he had a brooch making business, and he employed about 6 to 8 men, about 6 men and 2 youths, as a matter of fact. But they did all the work in a big shed in the back garden. And in this row of cottages, there was 4 more, just ordinary cottages in between, and then we came to the opposite end of this row of 6 cottages, and there was another man who had a business of his own, tool making, and he was what they called a file cutter. His name was Albert Ball. I don't think he was he might have been a cousin or something like that, but he wasn't a brother of John Ball. But anyway, this Albert Ball, he made files. And then after that, we come to another row of houses, 6 of them. These were really a peculiar kind of house in the sense that you went up steps to get to the living room, but down below there were cellars to all these houses, but they weren't cellars in the ordinary sense for putting the coal in like was the usual thing. Actually, they were workshops, and you went into these cellars from steps on the outside of the house, from the pavement actually, outside. And there was, as I say, there was 6 of these, and some of them, the men who lived in them, also worked in the shops. They were tool makers too. Some made files, some were brooch makers, and some were made all kinds of pliers and nippers and things of that description. Now, at the end of this row of houses, you shot off at right angles, and you went up kind of what we called an entry, because it was very narrow, just about wide enough for 2 people to walk along side by side. And this was what they called the Irish back. Actually, there was about 10 houses at the end of this entry, and they were the very old-fashioned back-to-back houses. That was just 1 room down and 1 room up. They had no gardens in front, and well, actually the reason they called them the Irish back was because they were inhabited mostly by people of Irish descent. They'd come over from Ireland, and Ireland at that time was a very poor country, and they'd been used to living under difficult circumstances, and so when they came to England and they got work in England, until they'd really got going and could afford to go in a better class of house, they lived in this style of house. And then when we've finished with these houses, we've got to come back again onto the high road, and there was a row of 4 more houses. And at the end of the row of this row of 4 houses, there was a shop, Mrs. Seddon's shop. Well, actually, I'll tell you more about that later on when I'm talking about myself, because we lived in this next door to this shop at one time. But as I say, I'll give you more information on that later on. And then there was quite a wide road led off. It wasn't a metal road, it was just a dirt road that they'd made, and you went up this road to get to the other side of these back-to-back houses. And I'll tell you more about those later, because my parents started their married life in one of those. Well, then you come back. It was called the camp. I don't know why they called it. We used to call it up the camp, but I don't know where it got its name from. But the point is, we'll come down from the camp and come back onto the main road, and there was another 6 houses all in a row, and behind these 6 houses there were also workshops, small ones, but they were big enough for men to work in, and some had forges in where they could, because they were tool makers also, and they could do the forging in these shops. One of them, though, was a baker, and he used to bake his bread in this place. But we'd come back onto the high road, to the front of this row of houses. One of them was Totty Wellsby's baker's shop. He sold mostly bread and cakes, not what we call confectionery, but scones and buns and things like that. At the end of this row of houses, now we come to the church grounds, the old Congregational Church, as it was. And the first thing you came to in the grounds was the schoolroom. And then from the schoolroom, there was a passage led from the schoolroom to the church. And then came the church itself, which was quite a marvellous affair, really, for such a small place, because it had a steeple that, well, it was so high that there was a big cross right on the top of the steeple, which was about 6 foot in length, and looking at it from the ground, it only looked about a foot. So it gives you some idea of how high the steeple was. Then next to the church was the recreation rooms, all part of the church this was. And by the way, I might tell you that this church was built by 2 spinsters. Their father was a mine owner. Now, this was in the days when the mines were owned privately. And their father, a man named Richard Evans, they came from Wales originally, I believe, owned this mine. And when he died, he left the mine and all his money, of course, to his 2 daughters. He'd got no sons. And these 2 daughters were very religiously inclined, and with a lot of the money that the father had left them, they built this church at the Old, which was really a good job, because the small population at the Old, and all being working class, they couldn't have afforded to have built a church. But anyway, I'm digressing a bit, I know now, from the buildings themselves, but I feel that I must say a few words about the church, because it had a nice big organ too, and we used to get some good organists, because being a good organ, some of those who played the organ liked to get onto this organ because it was so big. And one of the organists, which I'll tell you more about when I'm telling you my own life story, was a young man named Tom Berry, but more of that later. Anyway, at this recreational building that was built at the side, on the floor level, there was a long room with billiard tables in, and tables for playing dominoes and drafts and games like that. And that was where most of the old youth, particularly those connected with the church, used to spend their evenings, but particularly in winter, because it used to close down in the middle of the summer, and then we spent our time in the evenings mostly on the bowling green then. Well, after that we come to a house which was originally built for the minister of the church, but one of the church deacons actually took it over, because the minister who came went in this building called the Man's, and he didn't want the building that had been built for him. So this Matthew Hayes, he was one of the deacons of the church, and he was also a mineral water manufacturer. So he took over the house, and there was quite a bit of land at the side of it, and on this, in fact, there was 2 old cottages at the side of it, but he bought these 2 old cottages, knocked the walls down and made them all into one, and he used that as his little place where he made the mineral waters. And he also used to sell pickles and pickled onions, red cabbage, all that sort of thing. But now that stood right on the corner of the main Warrington Road and a road that led off to the right, which would be to the northwards, called the Old Lane. On the right-hand side of the Old Lane, as you go up, there was 2 cottages. Here again, one of them was inhabited by a tool maker, and he had his little shop at the back. Then he came to a row of 6 cottages that went off at right angles to the Old Lane. And your mum's father used to live in fact, your mum herself, of course, but her parents used to live in one of these cottages at one time, and there was some gardens near too that belonged to the cottages. They weren't right either in front or behind the cottages, they were away on the right. And he had his workshop in one of these gardens. Now, then after we passed that, we come to 2 more cottages, and they were a little bit more what you might call middle-class type of cottage, and one of them was inhabited by a widow. Her name was Miss Taylor, and she was she was a spinster. No, I made a mistake there. I said a widow. She wasn't a widow at all. She'd never been married. She was a spinster. But she was very interested in church work and did a lot of church work. And she also used to run what they call the Band of Hope. But I'll tell you more about that later. And then after those 2 cottages, we come to a row of 6 cottages. No, I'm wrong again, you must excuse me. We came to a row of 4 cottages, and these had gardens at the front and back. Now, at the farthest end of the row, your mother again used to live in this house because her parents moved into it later on. And they rented a little place where he used to do his tool making in another part of the Old. Well, and by the way, it was in this house that when I was first married, that I went to live with your mother and her parents, because we couldn't get a house. It was just after the First World War, and there was a very big shortage of houses at the time, but I'll tell you more of that later. Now, then there was a kind of a space which led into a field. And I'll tell you more about this later. It led into what we call the brickyard. But then after that we come to another row of 8 houses. And they'd now the gardens front no back. And then there was 2 cottages on their own. And then we come to another row of 6 cottages. Now, in between these two, the row of 8 cottages and the row of 6 cottages, there's a little cartway, and this cartway led to some stables at the back. Now, the first lot of the stables were quite a big affair, and that belonged to the mineral water manufacturer, Matthew Hayes. And of course there was no motor cars in those days, or motor lorries, anything like that, not at the Old anyway. And of course everything was carried about in horse-drawn vehicles. But I can tell you more about that later too. And there was also another lot of stables which the local coalman used to have for his horse and cart. And that brought us right to the end of the Old Lane, or the end of the houses in Old Lane on the right-hand side. And on the left-hand side of the Old Lane there was very few. In fact, there was only 3. There was 2 houses together, and then there was an old farmhouse and an old barn. And then, as you got back to the main road again, there was a big wall about 8 feet high, and behind this wall was a bowling green which was part of the old hotel. And the old hotel stood on the corner of the Old Lane and Warrington Road, and it faced it directly opposite the Old Inn. Now, then we turn out of Old Lane and we go along again on the right-hand side of the road going to Liverpool. And at about 100, there was a field, and then about 100 yards at the end of this field there was 2 more middle-class style of houses, and then there was a house that it was really old, but it was in good condition, and this was inhabited by some people named Menzies, and they were fairly rich, you know, considering the times, and it was quite a big house, this was. And that was on the right-hand side. It was reckoned to be the boundary of the Old. Now, there's one thing I omitted to tell you earlier on, and that was when I told you that on the left-hand side of the road, the boundary of Rainhill and Whiston went through the centre of Sam Strettle's farm. I also omitted to tell you that Rainhill never had tap water to individual houses. All the houses that were in Rainhill, if there was a row of, we'll say, 6 houses or 10 houses, they just had one tap outside for the whole of the row. And the people living in that row of houses had to take buckets and fill the buckets with water every time they wanted any water. Now, in Whiston, it was different. And as I say, we lived in Church View. My parents, at any rate, lived in Church View, which came within the borders of Whiston. So we had tap water inside. We were fortunate in that respect. And also, when you went up Holt Lane, the right-hand side of Holt Lane was in Rainhill, and the left-hand side was in Whiston. So all the houses on the right-hand side of Holt Lane, and most of them were, they all had to go to these taps, which just supplied water for that particular row of houses. Now, that we come to about the end of my description of a walk from the Stoops to the end of the Holt. So at this stage I'll take a bit of a rest, because you get a bit tired, you know, of keep talking, and when you're having to think at the same time, even though you have notes, it's difficult to keep looking at the notes and talking. In fact, the only satisfactory way would be to write it all out and then read it, but that would be quite a long job. So you'll have to put up with a lot of the halts when I stop for a few seconds to think, or I make a mistake. You'll have to allow for all that, because after all, I'm not a youngster now. So just for the present, I'll leave you, and then I'll come back and tell you more about my private life. Now for my autobiography. My father's back remembrance was when I was 2 years old. I was playing in the backyard of the house. I developed a headache. I went in the house, told my mother about my headache, and she picked me up, held me against her breast, sat down in a rocking chair. Of course, those were the kind of chairs that mothers used in those days to soothe the babies and rock them to sleep when they were fractious. But anyway, she sat down in the rocking chair and rocked me to sleep. And what I always remember was, oh, how soothing it was to be in my mother's arms and held against her breast. I shall never forget that. I mentioned in my journey through the Holt a row of houses facing the Warrington Road, and in one of these houses there was a group of 4. The end one was it was a shop, and this shop belonged to a Mrs. Seddon. Now, we lived next door to this Mrs. Seddon at the time when I was only a small child. And I can remember going to school from this house, and I started school at the age of 3. It was a usual thing in those days, as quite a lot of children started school at 3, because at Rainhill School one part of the school was what they call the infant school. There was 3 classes. There was the babies class, there was second class and first class. And you got to go through the whole of those before you went into the school proper, to standard 1. But anyway, putting that at one side, I was going to this Rainhill school one afternoon. It must have been in summer, because in those days even boys wore frocks, and I'd got a lovely white frock on. And I was walking to school on the parapet at the side of the road, and also on this parapet at intervals there were poles which carried the electric current for the trams which ran along the road. Well, I was walking along on the footpath, daydreaming, and evidently every now and again I must have turned me back and been walking backwards, because at one stage I suddenly turned round from walking backwards, and I was evidently right against one of these iron poles, and I bumped my face right into this pole, and of course my nose started bleeding and the blood ran all down onto my nice white dress. So I had to go back home and have my dress changed before I could go on to school. And that's another thing that lingers in my memory. Going back to the school business, in the babies class, I remember the first Christmas, because they had coal fires in the school in those days, and they were lit by gas lamps. And I remember we were sitting round the fire, the children in the class, and the teacher was telling us stories, fairy stories, and stories about Christmas, and somehow it all seemed like some different, as though you were in a different world, as though you'd gone up into fairyland, and the whole atmosphere was Christmassy. So I can always remember that first Christmas at school. And then I don't remember much more at school, not in the infants part, although I know that I graduated from one to the other. And I think the next thing that I remember well while I was at school was when I got into Standard 3. And in Standard 3 there was a very nice teacher named Miss Pickavance. And she was a lovely teacher, you know, and all the children loved her. And she was kind of, you did the right thing for her, you behaved because you liked her. She didn't need to be strict. And then between that, being in her class and going into Standard 4, which was the beginning of really the top classes, there wasn't much more that I remember that happened at school that's worth recording. So I'll have to leave school for a bit and go back to some other interesting part of my life that occurred perhaps earlier on before I got to Standard 4. There was one thing that I recollect now, and actually to tell you about it I'll have to go back a bit to when I must have been round about 2 or 3, because this was the coronation of King Edward VII, and there was quite a lot of celebrations in the village of Rainhill on the day of the coronation. And I remember that there was a big field day, and all the children were invited to this field day, and the young children, and of course I was only very young then, because I think it must have been either 1900 or 1901, possibly 1901. But the small children, like myself, we were all taken on decorated floats, what they call floats. They were like a lorry with no sides to, and they were drawn by horses. And I can always remember going in these decorated floats, and when we got to the big field where the celebrations were being held, I remember we had races and all that sort of thing, all for the benefit of the children. And then we had a nice tea, and then after the tea we were given a coronation cup. Well, I still have that cup, and I don't know who'll get it after I'm gone, but because there's only one cup and I've got 3 daughters, so I don't know how they'll manage to dispose of it. But as I say, that's another of the things that I can recollect when I think about it. One thing I ought to tell you about those days with regard to the school. There were mixed classes in those days. Boys sat with girls, and right from the very beginning, from when we were in the babies class right till Standard 7, which was about the highest class, and all the time you sat wherever the marks that you got for your work put you, so that you could be sat in amongst, boys were sat in amongst girls, and it was a perfectly natural thing. And I was in the same class as the girl who I married eventually. Her name was Edie Lyon at that time, and she was always in the same class that I was in, so of course I always knew her as a girl even before we started courting. Now, when we were at school, of course, most of the things that happened were like happened to most children. We played in the school playground. The boys used to play football, because although we were sat together in class, we had separate playgrounds, probably because the boys were rougher than the girls. But we boys used to play football in winter in the playground, and in summer we played cricket. The headmaster was, he played in the local cricket team, and he used to love to get us bowling to him in the school playground, and then he'd bowl at us, so that it kept him, gave him a bit of practice as well as giving us something to play at. Of course, we had other boyish games, like all of an athletic nature, which were all good for boys who were full of life. The girls, they were more for skipping rope and hopscotch and games like that. But they also enjoyed themselves at these games. Now, when we left school, when I say when we left school, I don't mean when we finished going to school. I mean at the end of the day, rather. When we weren't at school, put it that way, and we had plenty of time to play. the trouble was that at the Holt, although it was only a small place and it was almost countrified, as you could say, there wasn't many places where the children could play. And taking you back to the Holt Lane that I mentioned previously, and the row of cottages where your mother lived, where my wife, Edie, lived as a girl, just at the end of where the row of cottages where she lived, there was an entrance that led from the road into a field behind. The farmer, if he was going with his cart, he used to go up this kind of a lane at the side, although it wasn't really a lane, it was just an entrance to this field, but it stretched about 20 or 30 yards before he came to the field. But anyway, this particular field at one time had been, it must have been the soil must have been of a clay nature, because at one time it had been a brickyard where they made bricks. Of course, there was no buildings on the site. It was just that in those days they used to make the bricks, shape them, and then they used to put them in piles with straw in between, and to bake them they just used to light the straw and it used to bake the bricks that way. But anyway, after they'd taken quite a large amount of clay out, evidently the demand for bricks around the Holt at any rate must have dropped, because it was allowed to grow into a field. And Walter Strettle, the farmer who owned this particular field, he used to graze his cows in this field. But mostly they used to go to the top end of the field because the grass was better at that end. And very often, we boys, when we wanted to play football or cricket or anything like that, when out of school hours, used to go in this field. And of course, we always had to leave one boy on the lookout in case this farmer Strettle, Whopper Strettle we called him, because he was such a big man. But this boy had to keep a lookout in case Whopper Strettle came. And if he happened to come, then he would come and tell us, and we'd all run off, and we'd be gone by the time Whopper Strettle came. But that's where we used to play, in what they call it the brickyard. But as I say, it was a brickyard no longer, it was more like a meadow. But we spent a lot of time there, and Walter Strettle had quite a job keeping us off as boys. And I can always remember one time when he did actually get to the field, and because we hadn't put a lookout boy on, and we had to run for our life, as it were. And he actually caught one, and he gave him a good hiding. But that was the only way we could play, was either in Holt Lane, which there was plenty of room and there wasn't much traffic in those days. In fact, there was hardly any traffic. You could play quite safely, as long as you didn't make too much noise and bother the neighbours. But that was where we used to spend most of the time in the daytime. Of course, there was some lovely lanes around, because if you went up Holt Lane, and if you kept on going far enough, you came to a lane that led off at right angles that we called Back Lane, and that read right along until it joined up with Longton's Lane, which was nearly in Rainhill. And then on the other side of the village, of the Holt, you could go down Dragon Lane and walk along Stony Lane and come up Talbot's Lane, so that we had plenty of nice country walks where we could go and look for birds' nests and all that sort of thing. There's one or two ponds where we used to go paddling and catching minnows. We used to call them jack sharps because they used to dart about so fast. But that was mostly how we spent our time in the daytime. At night time we'd know where to go in summer. In winter the church and Sunday school was the centre of social life, and of course there was the Band of Hope and all different things connected with the church, but not a lot for school children. And I remember what we used to spend a lot of time playing was a game we called Rally-O. And we used to have two teams of boys, and one used to go out and hide, and the other team used to have the job of finding them. And of course you had to find them all before those who were doing the finding had their turn at hiding. And the reason we used to call it Rally-O or Relieve-O was because those who were searching, as they found the boys, they used to bring them back and put them in what we call the den, which was just a bit of a marked off part of the parapet. And the thing was, if one of those who was still free could run through this den and shout Relieve-O, those who were supposed to be prisoners in the den were allowed to go free then. But anyway, we used to spend a lot of winter nights playing that game. When we got tired of that, we used to go and stand in front of Townsend's shop, which had sweets and all that sort of thing in the window, and we used to look in the window and we used to play a game called First and Last Letters. And what we had to do was that one boy would look in the shop